Okay, I'm Meg Richardson, and I'm the professor of assistant professor of UU history and associate dean of the faculty. And I'd love to start out by asking, what do you guys already know about Aurelia Henry Reinhardt? Like anything. What have you got?
We have a chair named for Aurelia Reinhardt.
Lindy?
There's a big mural of her across the alumni room or whatever at Mills.
Wow. Oh, cool.
She was the first female moderator of the Unitarian Association.
True.
Oh, wow.
And the second moderator.
The second moderator?
Yeah.
Oh, cool.
I got some stuff on that.
Good.
Anybody?
We have an endowed chair named for her that Gabriella holds.
Does anybody know where you can find her picture at Starr King?
Yeah.
In
Foyer.
the archives.
All right. One of the things I found out in researching Aurelia Henry Reinhardt was that she didn't prepare for lectures. She would just go and talk about whatever she wanted for usually at least an hour. So, and it would be fascinating. Like, people would remember what she said for like 30 years later. They could like talk. So that was super encouraging because there was really a lot of information, and this was not a week where I thought I was going to have this whole week to work on a presentation for you guys, and it turned out that wasn't true. So anyway, that's like. So one of the things that makes sense is that she was born on April Fool's Day. So that was in 1877. So another challenge in researching Aurelia Henry Reinhardt is that there are 10,903 articles on her.
Did you read them all?
I think Arliss tried. Arliss made a decent attempt, but there are over 5,500 articles in California newspapers alone, okay? With results from 46 states, District of Columbia, Canada, England, Guam, Northern Ireland, and Australia. Does anyone want to guess which 4 states are missing? Throw something out there.
North Dakota.
Nope, she had North Dakota.
Florida.
Where? Florida's represent.
Alaska.
You got one. 3 more.
State yet, right?
Hawaii?
Hawaii's in. In fact, there was a huge little pocket of Mills Club people in Hawaii. So she was in Hawaii quite frequently.
Texas.
Texas is in. So the other ones were New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and West Virginia. Yeah. Let's see. So Arliss is going to talk. The way we broke this up is we said heart and soul and mind, but we're really doing heart, mind, soul. And then Arliss is going to give you a little teaser about the treasures over at Starr King. So the bio that everybody uses, like it's pretty much what they use for the Wikipedia entry, is from Dorothy Emerson's book, Standing Before Us. And the bio in there was written by Claire Fisher, and she was the first Aurelia Henry Reinhardt chair, and Gabriella is the second. My hope is just to give you some I'm really gonna dish. I'm gonna give you the gossip, and anything you wanna know more specifically, I'm hoping there'll be time for questions. So like, I have a million stories now, and so I'll give you some of the big ones. But she was born in San Francisco. Her parents were both from the East Coast. Her dad was from Vermont, and her mom was from Pennsylvania. And so she was a California girl. And their family was very entrepreneurial, and the whole family, extended family, would be involved in things. Like her mom had a boarding house in Berkeley, and there were 6 Henry children, and so whoever was at home would help work. And when the kids all got big, they replaced them with, like, I think the 6 kids were replaced by a staff of 8. So they got their work out of those kids. So, so let's see. So her husband, she met her husband when she was 12 years old, and he was 21. And yeah, I mean, they didn't get married then. But so the deal is, like, that was when she was living in Southern California, right?
Yeah, down near San Diego.
Yeah, and then they moved back up north. So there was a period there, like when she was 12, her big sister kind of hung out in the same social. His name was George Frederick Reinhardt, and they called him Fritz. They also called him Fred. So she knew Fritz then when she was kind of a middle school kid, and then she came across him again when she was a student at Cal. And he was like a senior. He had studied somewhere else and then gone to Cal. And he was like a football star. He was the full tackle, is that the term? And
Asking the wrong crowd.
So like he was, and it was a winning team. So he was kind of a big deal on campus. And then he went to medical school at Cal, and when he was at medical school, he managed the football team. So there's this football thing going on, and great. So they're on each other's radar, but it wasn't a love connection. Like so there's some mythology about her that said that they were in love for like 20 years, and it doesn't seem to be true. So what happened was he stayed. Is that me? It's me. It's California. It might be my husband. It won't. It'll wait. So basically, what was sort of interesting about the love connection part of it was that Arliss is going to get into her teaching career, but she was teaching in Idaho, and the local fraternity had applied to become part of Phi Beta Kappa, and Fred went out to see if they were worthy. And we kind of think he had something else in mind, because she threw a party. He came out with one of her sisters, and she threw a party for them. And they had when I say throw a party, there was an orchestra. People wore tuxedos and long gowns, and they had this. It was called a rollicking dance, which apparently she had imported from California, and so you actually danced through the whole house, and I think it was like a two-step is all I could figure out. So it was a pretty big party. So I think there was something on the radar there, but so let's see. So the family business, the boarding house, which was on LeConte Avenue, became a hotel on Euclid, which was the Northgate Private Hotel. And Aurelia's mom had very strict rules. Like, there was a girl whose fiance visited her, and she wouldn't let the fiance come to dinner because he didn't have a dinner jacket. And so there were students and also permanent adult tenants. And Mr. Henry still had his grocery business. And as of 1903, he diversified into real estate, which they had real estate all along, and insurance. Can you imagine being in San Francisco in 1903, entering the insurance business? That is like such bad timing. Just saying. So they had like kind of roller coaster with their family businesses, but overall success. The oldest of her two brothers was a mining engineer, and spent time in Mexico and Alaska. And so let's see. So meanwhile, Fred is working at Cal, and he's the university physician, or one of the physicians, and he actually started their health system. Like, he built the building and set it up. And he lived with a bunch of his male friends on Telegraph Ave. And the Berkeley Gazette said the trio of the best known and most prominent bachelors in the city. So Aurelia's other brother, Paul, who was a cellist, had advanced TB. And so Dr. Reinhardt was giving advice about his care. And Aurelia actually left her job in Idaho and came back to be his nurse. And the two of them went off to Arizona because that's what you did with TB. And so in the fall of 1908, that's where she was. And her other relatives would come out and visit and pitch in, but it was mostly her looking after him and being his nurse. But she signed the book for the First Unitarian Church of Berkeley in 1908, and her parents had joined in 1906, and her sister joined in 1907. And a little girl who went to church there remembered the three of them as tall sisters who were the living embodiment of all the fairy tale princesses. She was considered tall, and I had to look to find out what tall meant, because I know what tall means to me, because my daughter is 6'2", and my other daughter is 5'9". And so she was 5'9", like Rebecca.
Wow.
So let's see. So in the spring of 1909, Fred recommended a change from Phoenix to Colfax, California, which is, I don't know California geography, it's Sierra foothills. And it was a Canadian doctor who was gaining a lot of attention for his work, and he had totally disrupted the treatment paradigm. He, instead of making them go on long marches and that kind of thing, he put them to bed and said rest. And they arrived there in May 31st, 1909, but he was just too sick. People would, she just spent the time reading to him or reading to herself, and she needed to make money, so she tried to write some short stories. She wrote 9, and it was completely disappointing. She got all the rejection letters, and she eventually came to get professional criticism of her stories, and they liked her writing. They liked her characters, but they said her plots just were lacking. So her older sister had married a wealthy New York guy, and so in the summer of 1909, she came out to California with the baby and her toddler and threw a party at the Claremont Country Club. It's just so wild that like all these places are here. And she used Fred's membership to throw the party there. And so Sister Alice watched Paul so that Aura could go. They called her Aura, could go to the party. And a telegram interrupted the party. And so she and Fred went back to Colfax on the train the next morning. And Paul was still alive when they got there and still conscious. And he asked them about the baseball game. It was the San Francisco Seals. And he held their hands in his, joined their hands together, and smiled. And they leaned over his bed, and he said, "Aura, you've been eating onions." And he died later that night. So there was already a plan to get married, and both families knew. And now that Paul was dead, they went ahead with the plans, and they formally announced the engagement on November 8th and got married in December. Now, later on, she told a bunch of Mills seniors that at the time she was engaged, she had never even kissed him. So that's another thing kind of going against the love connection for 20 years thing. So when she was, before the engagement, somebody had asked her mother which one of the girls is Fred in love with. And she said, "None of them, just me." Let's see, so that's about, So he had already asked for a leave of absence from the university, so they had a long honeymoon and they went to Europe. They sailed from New York to Bremen, and 10 days after their wedding, and they spent a month in Vienna. extensive travels in Italy, France, the Iberian Peninsula, and the UK. And they toured Italy by motor car. And she found out she was pregnant, and she told her friend later, I was sick behind every statue in Italy. And there were early difficulties in the marriage, and her friends attributed that to him being German. And of course, he was German American. And my maiden name is Schellenberg, and I can tell you, it's not German, it's the patriarchy. The only thing I can figure out about why they thought he was German was he had a thing for Kaiser Wilhelm II. He liked constitutional monarchy, which she was really into democracy, and so that was a thing. But also he was into traditional gender roles as far as their house and the children, and he made her ask him for money, even for a postage stamp. She had to say who she was writing to and ask him for the money for the postage stamp. And the whole time they were married, first class postage was 2 cents. So, she entertained and she went out frequently, and she was very active in the local branch of the club that became the AAUW. And she would talk to the different clubs and things. She was elected to an officer position in the Sierra chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution, and she represented. She got involved with the College Women's Equal Suffrage Association and directed a play for them for a fundraiser. And somebody asked her husband about her work for women's suffrage, and he said, "That's one subject we don't discuss at home."
Ooh.
So he wasn't a total jerk. He taught hygiene at the university, and he used his course on hygiene to teach frankly about venereal disease. And he did important work in tropical medicine and in the study of rabies. And he advocated for public health needs and procedures. And in Christmas 1910, he probably saved his brother-in-law's life by performing an appendectomy on him. Oh, okay. So I gotta wrap up. I got a lot more to say, but you can just ask me questions about this stuff later. But one thing that's interesting is about the pregnant and being sick in Italy is that when she got home, about a month after they returned from their trip, he was working in the infirmary, and he mentioned to his associate, who was a woman who was a doctor, that was Dr. Eleanor Stowe Bancroft. He told her, "My wife's in labor." So she was like, "What?" And she went to their house, and she found Aurelia all by herself, and the baby was premature. It was 6.5 months old. Or born at, the term. And so the doctor, Dr. Bancroft, improvised an incubator out of a wash boiler, and the baby died that night. So that meant when she became pregnant again, she was terrified of giving birth, and she stopped accepting social engagements, and they hired a nurse at the end of her pregnancy to live with them, and everything went great, and she actually had 2 sons. And she was so into her babies. She wrote, for the first one, she wrote 38 poems for him, including a series of poems on the trees of Berkeley. So what's interesting, though, is after her marriage, she kept her entry in Who's Who in America. She kept it as Henry Aurelia. And after she got married, there was a cross-reference from Reinhardt, Mrs. G.O.F. So, but she sort of kept her name until she became president of Mills College, where at that point she changed her entry to Reinhardt Aurelia Henry. And I have stuff to say about her sons, but you can ask me questions about that if you're interested. And I'm going to turn over to, I didn't talk about how he died, but there's an opportunity for that later.
My task was to tell you a little bit about her education and about Mills College. But after being one of the very few girls to graduate from boys' high school in San Francisco as opposed to girls' high school, she studied at the University of California at Berkeley. It was only at Berkeley in those days, completing a bachelor's degree with a major in English literature in 1898. And while attending the University of California, she, along with her sisters, worked at their mother's boarding house in Berkeley. And after she graduated, she taught elocution and physical culture at the University of Idaho until 1901. She then, when she didn't get a job that she wanted at the University of Idaho, she applied to Yale, where she went from 1901 to 1903. One of very few females to attend Yale in those days. We're talking about 1901. At Yale, she enjoyed study of the classics, medieval and modern languages. And she traveled abroad as a recipient of an Association of Collegiate Alumni Fellowship. That was a precursor of the American Unitarian Women's Association, the College Women University. And she studied as a fellow at Oxford. She traveled in Italy, and she edited and published an English language translation of one of Dante's major works, De Monacaria, which became a college textbook. She completed a PhD in literature at Yale in 1905, one of few women PhDs, I think, in those days. Her doctoral dissertation, which she wrote while she was at Oxford, was on Ben Jonson's The Silent Woman, which Variety webpage calls a historically significant piece of buffoonery that enthralled 17th and 18th century audiences. The Washington Shakespeare Theater, who performed this play in recent years, said, with biting wit and sharp satire, Jonson considers what it means to be a man, to be a woman, and to be a human, but without voice. Reinhardt, I can tell you, was not without voice. She taught at Lewiston State Normal School in Idaho, taking a year off to revise her dissertation for publication. And she eventually became head of the English department. Then she returned to teaching at the University of Idaho, and then to Lewiston State Normal School, and finally to the Extension Division of the University of California, again, still only in Berkeley. On May 16, 1916, the Honolulu Star Bulletin declared, "New president announced by Mills College. Coast Institution elects woman of forceful personality as head." The paper, of course, was talking about Aurelia Reinhardt, whose then national reputation as a scholar of distinction, and spoke of her as preeminent intellectual attainments. She became the president of the then struggling Young Mills College in Oakland at a time when the only women's college on the West Coast and the second oldest women's college in the country. In 1927, the Washington, D.C. Evening Star reported universal expression of regret were voiced over the retirement of Dr. Aurelia Henry Reinhardt, who served during the past year as president of the Association of University Women. Dr. Reinhardt was urged to retain her office, but declared her duties as president of Mills College were so heavy that she felt she could not do justice to either position should she attempt to continue both. And she went all throughout the country speaking for the university, women, and for Mills College. And in those days, it wasn't easy to go to Ohio and then to Michigan and then to Washington, D.C., as she did. The Mills College webpage of history said that Mills was founded in 1852 as the Young Ladies Seminary in Benicia, California. In those days, women's colleges and women's schools were called seminaries for reasons I don't know. But that was 2 years after California became a state. Then missionaries Susan and Cyrus Mills who were champions of equal education for women, bought the seminary and renamed it Mills College. And 6 years later, the same year that Oakland was incorporated as a city, Mills moved to its current 135-acre campus in Oakland. It had 125 students at that time. But the college grew quickly, with students of diverse faiths and background enrolling from many states and countries, the Mills College claims. Arriving in 1916 with 2 young children, Reinhardt is said to have remarked that she was the first college president who arrived on campus pushing a perambulator, stroller. Her husband had died, and the youngest of her 2 children was just 3 years old. She was the first woman president of a major college, and she served as a president for 27 years, from 1916 to 1943, through a period of substantial growth. She was the longest serving president in the school's history. During her tenure, Mills constructed 17 additional buildings, growing from 11 buildings to 28. Now, a little bit too many for them. She increased enrollment threefold in her first 15 years and gained national recognition for the school and for herself. According to the Mills College webpage, during her tenure as president, in 1917, Mills was admitted to the Association of American Universities and College. In 1920, the graduate division opened, offering programs both to women and men. And this is still true. The undergraduate school is all women. Some controversy and furor when they tried to change that a few years ago to get some more money. In 21, Mills conferred its first master's degree. In 26, the education department at Mills established a children's school, the first laboratory school for aspiring teachers west of the Mississippi. And in 1941, Mills became one of the nation's first liberal arts colleges to grant a degree in modern dance, showing their interest in the fine arts as well as the more scientific aspects. Reinhardt traveled the country speaking as the national president of the American Association of University Women, then an organization of about 18,000 members, and as president of Mills College. She would combine the two when possible. On her way to Washington, D.C. in 1924, she stopped along the way in Wisconsin, Ohio, and New York. In Indianapolis in 1926, the newspapers explained she warned Butler University students against letting social life submerge academic learning in her controversial address at the university. Reinhardt said that there was too much tendency in American colleges and universities to put play before work. Why this was controversial, I'm not sure. In her spare time, when she wasn't leading a multitude of civic and Unitarian organizations, she studied the flora and the fauna around the school campus. Encyclopedia.com says, Reinhardt's dynamic 27-year administration transformed Mills from an unstable establishment into an important, internationally known institution. Although her leadership was sometimes seen as erratically personal and even dictatorial, she won the admiration of her colleagues and the loyalty of her students. The guide to Reinhardt's papers at Mills College states, as president of Mills College, Reinhardt found a task worthy of her formidable personality. She immersed herself immediately and completely in her work. She thrived in her newfound challenge, and with a vision of Western women's colleges equal to the best of women's college in the East. She enlisted numerous patrons, benefactors, and dedicated faculty in the work of Mills College. The college expanded physically and intellectually, weathering, along with its president, the Depression and 2 world wars. By the time of Aurelia Reinhardt's retirement in 1943, the college, in character and spirit, reflected Aurelia's own persona, liberal, progressive, vigorous. Mills College since that time has gone through some periods of instability, lack of money, crisis of one sort or another, very much like our own Starr King. Reinhardt was a recipient of 6 honorary degrees, including a Doctor of Law from the University of California, the first woman to get one. The University of Southern California, Mount Holyoke, Oberlin College. She also served on the Board of Trustees at Starr King for 15 years, from 32 to 47. In 32, during the Great Depression, Pacific Unitarian School for the Ministry, now called Starr King, and how I will refer to it, was in great financial difficulty. The value of the stocks had declined sharply with the Depression, and the treasurer had misappropriated nearly half of the small endowment. When he was found out, he committed suicide. Earl Morris Wilbur had resigned in 1931, and William Morgan became the head of the school. There were essentially no students. The Reverend Aaron Gill Martin told me that one year during the Depression, when he was at Meadville, Starr King sent its only student there to study. The board asked the American Unitarian Association, AUA, to appoint a committee to advise it on whether the school should continue or not. The Reverend Louis Cornish, the president of the American Unitarian Association, was the chair. Aurelia Reinhardt served on that committee. Their report, the Cornish report, concluded that it is evident that during the past 27 years, the school has been able only in part to fulfill the intentions of its founders. But that past success or failure should be judged as somewhat incidental to the future development of the school. The committee sees no sufficient reason for abandoning the efforts of religious training in Berkeley. Thus, the school continued. And Reinhardt joined the board of Starr King that same year. I think she liked the challenge. She was still on the board when she was the moderator of the American Unitarian Association in 1941. Hosea Bartlett, later the head of the school, remembered, "I first entered the affairs of Starr King as a trustee when the board chairman was Aurelia Henry Reinhardt. In persona, she came on like a winged victory in an academic gown, as the official Mills portrait will testify." The official Mills portrait has her stunning and very imperial. Joe also told me once that while he was a board member and before he became head of the school, he was living on a houseboat in the Seattle area, and they held a party, and I think it must have been a fundraising dinner as we now have. And Aurelia Reinhardt came in, put down her coat, went into the kitchen, picked up the hors d'oeuvres, took them out, and immediately took over the whole party. And at that time, he described her like the sculptured figure on the prow of the old sailing boats, leading forward, ever forward. She was a member of the 1936 AUA Commission of Appraisal, a very important committee that basically restructured the AUA. It also recommended continuing the school. She suggested W.H. Radcliffe Jr., who became the architect of our building over across the street in 1941-42 when it was built. She knew Radcliffe from his work at Mills. In 45, she nominated the Reverend Arnold Crompton, her minister in Oakland, for the board. And Crompton also taught history at the school. And he remained in close connection with the school for some 22 years. In 1945, the school selected Edward Ornstein as its new acting dean. The AUA sent a telegram saying that if the school hired Ornstein, the AUA would cut off their money. I'm not sure why, but anyway. Reinhardt replied to the Starr King board chairman, Mr. Chairman, it has always been the policy of our denomination for our institutions to be independent and private. I move that this board elect Mr. Ornstein for a period of 2 years, and that the association be informed in the appropriate language where it can go. In 1946, it was Reinhardt who sent a letter to the AUA asking about being their custodian of the school's capital endowment, which it still is. After 15 years on the board, Reinhardt retired in 1947. But in 1965, her son, Paul, who taught ophthalmology at Stanford Medical School, was elected to the board. In 1981, Dr. Claire Fisher was appointed to a newly created position established, quote, to ensure a feminist perspective on the faculty, a full-time woman professor. Dr. Gabriel Mattini now holds that professorship. It's named the Aurelia Henry Reinhardt Professorship.
And it's our only named chair. Like, I mean, like, it's like, you know how Jesus said the poor are always with you, and it's not a commandment. I think the same thing goes for named chairs. Like, it's not a commandment. We could have more. Just putting that out there to the universe to manifest that we could have more named chairs.
If you could
Right,
wish,
Jessica?
you wish to give the money necessary,
Excellent.
probably a
We have
couple $1 million.
partially funded Till Evans Chair in Religious Education.
Yay.
Cannot be utilized till it reaches $500,000, and we're at about 315,000 on that.
That's close.
You wanted me to talk about the professorship, the chair?
Yes.
In 1973, when Alicia Forsey entered Starr King as a student, there were 7 men and 6 women in her class at Starr King. She said Starr King was not prepared for women to be there. Women were told to preach like a man and to behave as successful men behave.
Cool.
Several of the women on the school, the students, went to the Board of Trustees asking for a full-time woman faculty member to be appointed. The faculty at that time said no, I think because they didn't have the money. Roz Reynolds, a board member, proposed this request. But after they said no, they came the next year. The board said yes. Roz resigned so she could work full-time to raise the money for this professorship, to, quote, achieve a balance in the presence of men and women on the faculty. And the first person chosen was to be a woman. After that, they were to check about the balance and then decide. And Roz, in many ways, kind of like Reinhardt, full steam ahead. She devoted intensely her life to raising money, and she raised, I think, some 210,000. They were hoping for 350, but they settled for 210,000. And she was relentless in trying to raise this money. My husband served on that committee, so I remember. And then they made the announcement, which I won't go into. It was a very interesting announcement. But they had like 80 applications.
Wow.
And
What
they,
year was it?
this by time 1973, about 1975, by the time they got it together. And Claire Fisher was chosen. Claire Fisher taught at the school for 24 years as professor of religion and culture. Claire also served on the GTU board and on the doctoral committees. And it is alleged that Claire had up to 21 doctoral students under her supervision at the same time. Okay.
All right. I have something, like, I have a couple things out of what Arliss said, but like one of them is, Arliss told you that Mills is the second oldest women's college. It was founded in 1852 in North America, let's say. Okay, so guess which one is the oldest, which was established in 1772?
Upperland.
No,
That's
women's college.
Red?
but it's still a women's college.
Oh.
Barnard?
Okay, I haven't heard it.
Wellesley.
Nope, not Wellesley.
Smith.
Mount Holyoke.
Bryn Mawr.
Okay, I can tell you, like, I'll go in order for the ones you said, okay? So like Vassar is founded in 1861, so 9 years after Mills. Wellesley was 1870. Smith, okay, Smith is a little funky, but like you can count it. It was like gathered in, it was like the idea was approved in 1871 and then they actually started doing classes in 1875. So I think you could say 1871 or 1875, but it's ahead of Radcliffe, which is 1879, and Bryn Mawr was 1885. And Mount Holyoke, that's another weird one, but they give it 1888, but it was established in 1837. So that's the oldest of the seven sisters, but it's not counted as older than Mills, so like, I don't know. And then Barnard was 1889. So the oldest one is in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. It's called Salem College, it's still going. And it was a trailblazer for early American civil rights because it granted admission to both Native Americans starting in 1826 and African Americans. There were 2 enslaved African American girls who were accepted at Salem. Hannah, who was a 10-year-old, this is like the seminary thing and it being school. There was a 10-year-old named Hannah who entered the school in 1785 people. And Anna Maria Samuel, who attended the school and lived in the Single Sisters house from 1793 to 1795. So anyhow, I thought that was interesting, but that's not really our stuff. But
When did it start?
1772, but more like a school, not really a university.
I think it was established as a college about 1835.
Yeah.
It was before.
Oh, okay, before 1852. Yeah, because it's got,
As Wesley, not Wellesley, but Wesley.
okay.
It's the same. It's really hard to know because when you first had students and when you were first chartered are very different. Like
And-
Starr King started in 1904, but they wasn't really chartered until 1906. So
Right.
How do you?
And a lot of these women's schools were like schools more than colleges, and you know, so it's like so slippery. But like, so like you could probably make cases. But I just thought that was interesting. Okay, so on the soul part, I kind of did her commitments and her lessons for us was the way I was thinking of that. And I'm going to go through it fast because I think her life is kind of more interesting. But she had, so she actually died in 1948, January 28, 1948. She had just come back from a trip to Europe. And it was 15 days after her last speech for the AAUW at a UNESCO reception. And she died when she had just been visiting her son in Switzerland. Her older son became a very famous ambassador. And so she was with her other son, Paul, who is on the Starr King board eventually. And if you want to know, were these people Unitarian? His house was called Channing House. So she died at Channing House, and her ashes are in the Chapel of the Chimes at Oakland's Columbarium, which sounds like a great, like now that's on my bucket list.
Oh, you should go. There's lots of good people.
I know, right? And it looks beautiful. I've seen all the pictures online, and so her other son was an ambassador in Russia at the time that she visited him. So. So she belonged to a lot of clubs. I'm not going to go through all of them. Arliss covered some of that, but for an example of how busy she was, in her 3rd year at Mills, she spoke on 47 formal occasions, gave 2 sermons at Vespers, 15 addresses to the college assemblies, 29 lectures on her book series, and she gave a picnic address. And she also gave an annual address to the freshmen, and she preached the baccalaureate sermon for 14 years in a row. So she was really out there, and she did a lot of her club work even when she was married. She was also really interested in drama and elocution, and after she got married, she was in a play that was benefiting the Unitarian Church in Berkeley, and I just thought it was typecasting. She played a goddess. She was very involved in peace. Now, you'll get from Arliss's talk that she was president of Mills during 2 world wars and also the Great Depression. And so during World War I, she began non-credit courses in knitting, sewing, cooking, which was like war bread, and also meat substitutes. And they also did special courses on current history and Red Cross techniques. So in World War II, she did more Red Cross classes, and she also taught the women automobile mechanics and occupational therapy. So she was totally out there as being a peace activist. She said she was a peace activist, and that really came out in World War I. In the Spanish-American War, before she was doing this presidency thing, she actually had a big party for officers and their men in Berkeley before they were, it was the Idaho guys. So the connection was that they had come out from Idaho where she had been teaching, and then they were going to be deployed to Manila. So she had a party for them in Berkeley before they were deployed. So I was kind of thinking, okay, how did she go from doing a party to being a peace activist? Kind of interested in that, but I didn't track it down. So she supported the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles. She supported the formation of the League of Nations. She was a friend of Herbert Hoover. She met him when she was at Yale. While she was at Yale, there was the 200th anniversary of Yale University, and they gave out a lot of really famous people honorary degrees, like including Mark Twain, for example. And there was this skinny guy with spectacles from Princeton, and nobody was talking to him, so Aurelia kind of chatted him up, and it turned out to be Herbert Hoover, who may be the most famous out of the whole bunch, but nobody knew who he was. He was an economist at Princeton at the time. So she gave a lot of her time and energy to speaking and organizational work for peace. And let's see, and she traveled all over, like Japan. They said the length and breadth of Latin America, for example. She was in Vienna the day that it was annexed by Germany. Her son was the vice consul. It was his first diplomatic position. He was vice consul in Vienna. He smuggled her out on the Orient Express, and she went to Istanbul, Greece, Beirut, Palestine, Egypt, and then sailed to Italy, where she went to Florence and Milan. And then she decided she wanted to see her son again, so she went back. They tried to get her back into Austria, and when she was on the border, they held her and the other people in her group for 2 hours, and they confiscated her newspapers, which really, really made her angry. And she let them know what she thought without suppressing truth. And she actually became physically ill over the encounter. And she managed to replace after Austria, she went to Switzerland. She was able to replace her newspapers. So that was all very important. So let's see. There's tons more on that. And for the environment, she was super interested in the environment. She loved nature. She loved bicycling. One of the things, like when she bought a house, she actually built a house in Tahoe when she was more toward retirement. And somebody visited her on that. And anybody who visited her, she put them to work, even in construction. And she would wear divided skirts so she could bicycle and ride horses. But she never learned to drive. And she did a lot of environmental preservation, like the redwoods. And she was a commissioner on the park department for East Bay. And when it started, she was one of 5 original board members and the only woman. And they just renamed a park in her honor. They had a grove of redwoods within the park named for her, and now they've named the whole park just this last year.
Where is
In Oakland, fittingly. Yeah.
That's interesting.
And she said in a speech in how many lands have the groves been the most ancient temples? And as president of Mills, she encouraged every student to walk and experience the leafy grounds of the Oakland campus every day. She advocated against unchecked development and served on city planning boards too. And her cousin, her first cousin, Aurelia Harwood, was the first female president of the Sierra Club. Yeah. So Claire Fisher said her persistence in warning against the threat to nature from rampant development was relentless and took many forms. This view was based on a theology she believed to be infused by Christian Unitarian understanding. Yeah, she was on the Oakland Chamber of Commerce, on their city planning committee. When they renamed the park, they said a lot of her civic duties dealt with improving Oakland and taking care of its people. I think it's extremely important that people recognize that women had huge roles in the civic responsibilities within our cities and counties and in the formation of what we know as California today. So we already discussed she was lecturing all over in AAUW. She was a Republican for politics, and that was okay then.
That's a very different thing.
Yeah. And she publicly defended Anita Whitney, who was a renowned radical, when Whitney was arrested during the Red Scare following World War I. Basically, that decision said that, by Justice Brandeis, said that only a clear and present danger would be sufficient for legislative restriction of the right of free speech, which was the standard that was employed against the communists again during the second Red Scare, the 1950s. So in 1928, she was a Republican elector from California. But she campaigned for Herbert Hoover, her friend. So, let's see. So she was an advocate for the Indian Defense League. She supported the Japanese when they were interned. She was a big advocate for women, for education and suffrage. During the Depression, she advocated for teens. And I even found something for LGBTQ. One of the visiting instructors in the college brought his boyfriend with him, and Aurelia had a visit in her office from one of the college people, and she told him, he's doing great in the classroom, leave him alone. And she believed in affirming the individual and their contributions, and let's see.
And next we've got about 5 minutes.
Oh gosh, and we have a lot to say about the Commission of Appraisal. But I can tell you, like, Arliss touched on it, but basically in the Commission of Appraisal, that was the first Commission of Appraisal, and there were some other cool people on it too, like Frederick May Elliott, who was a minister in the Midwest, and James Luther Adams, who was the minister of the Wellesley Church, and she was the only woman. And they basically wrote the job description for the moderator. They created the position of moderator. And the guy that was appointed the first moderator was just in the position for a year. So I kind of feel like he was a placeholder for her. I feel like she wrote her own job description. And it was meant to be, at that time, a spiritual leader. It was only when the merger happened that it became chair of the board. And she wrote a chapter on worship in the Commission of Appraisal report, which is in the documentary sources, and it's also in the Standing Before Us, Dorothy Emerson book. And she also wrote a portion of the Commission of Appraisal report that talked about the future for what is now Starr King. So that comes out of her work. And that was 1936, right? Or anyhow, it was right after this period of no students and bad. So
Right, yeah, it was before she was on the board.
yeah, so that was before she was on the board. Oh, but you know what? She was appointed to that because the year before she had been the Ware Lecturer, and she was the Ware Lecturer immediately after Jane Addams. And James Luther Adams told me the joke that Jane Addams told at the beginning of her Ware Lecture. So I was like, and that was, Jane Addams did the Ware Lecture in May, and then in December she got the Nobel Prize. So, so she would have been a very hard act to follow, but it seems like she did really well because she got appointed to be on the Commission of Appraisal, and then she was the first moderator, and she was incredibly committed to Unitarianism, and traveled as moderator all over, just in the way that she did for Mills, and the only reason she stopped after 2 years was because it was during the war and travel was impossible. And so she had to step down. She briefly served as a minister of the First Unitarian Church of Oakland. And I asked Sherry about that. And basically she was preaching so often there that they kind of felt like she was the interim minister. And when they appointed their minister, before they made the decision, they sent him to her house to visit her and meet her and get her okay. And then the next morning they told him, Aurelia says it's okay. Yeah, exactly. So,
Yeah, she wasn't actually a minister, she was just called out because she
Yeah.
assumed the role.
yeah, she did. And she had an office in the church. She had a desk. She had her papers there. She was pretty, So I thought for some of the lessons for us, she was not afraid to change her mind or evolve her opinions. She cared about people as individuals, and she had faith in them and what they could become. And her faith was, like her optimism, was contagious, giving you self-confidence and power so you could not doubt yourself. She made you feel capable of anything. She was a lifelong advocate for the marginalized and the dispossessed, and took the side of those who were marginalized. And let's see, she called everyone she worked with dear colleague. And when people asked her about, like, what about men faculty working with you, she said, they don't work for a woman, they work with one.
At least with her.
Yeah. One of her secretaries in the 1940s was asked, how can she get so much done? And she said, she has a dual motor. One is almost a Confucian sense of responsibility to family, to work, to the ideal of learning and wisdom, to life. And also, she has a near Renaissance curiosity and interest in what for her was always an expanding universe. So she brought those two powers together to save Mills College. And she said the university began as and continues to be that human institution interested in conserving truth and in disciplining men and women to take the vanguard in their day as preservers of truth and searchers for new truth. Now, this week I've been teaching, in fact, I'm going to go back and teach sociology of religion. And one of the things we've been talking about is soteriology, and that's like how you tell religions apart. And she really was a savior for Mills College, and I think too for Starr King. When she took on the job at Mills, she basically called up a friend of hers and said, I've just been asked to do this, and this college is dying, and they've appointed me president. Will you come and help me give it new life? I don't know that we've left any time for questions.
Buttonhole us along the way.
Her son, her baby, was only 6 months old when her husband died.
What did he die of?
That is such a good question.
Because I was going to ask following our.
Yeah, the question being, like, did he die under suspicious circumstances? No, he did not. He actually, on his 45th birthday, somebody said, how are you doing? And he said, I'm in excruciating pain. And he had been treating a patient for a carbuncle and come down with it. And a carbuncle, I Googled, is a connection of infected cysts with pus in them under your skin. And it's the kind of thing, like, you could give somebody an antibiotic and clear up. But because it was, 1914? 1916? That's like, anyhow, they didn't have the miracle drugs. And so he had 6, he was in his own infirmary with 6 consulting physicians, and they tried surgery and it didn't work, and he died. And what was beautiful was they had a tradition, like when he would come home from work, she would be upstairs with the kids and she would call down, Fred, we're here. And he would say, coming up. And when she was with him as he was dying, she said, Fred, we're here. And he said, coming up. So that was kind of beautiful.
So he got the infection from the carbuncle?
From the carbuncle he got a carbuncle from treating somebody with a carbuncle.
Oh, okay.
So he came down with it. And it was excruciatingly painful. And killed him. I think that other patient lived.
Oh.
Yeah.
Do we know how she avoided getting TB all that time she was caring for somebody with TB?
No
It was very
idea.
contagious.
She was like, but one of the things that people always talk about her was how strong she was physically. You know, that she was tall and strong. And yeah, that's a very good question. She did.
Our early Unitarian ancestors in Boston, most of them, or many of them, had tuberculosis. And I cringe at the thought they went from here to there, to this family, to this and that one. And then the dear wife dies of tuberculosis, and they go on and they go for a ride on a boat. That was sort of the cure for rest, and they come back. But they must have infected everybody along the way.
Sharing that communion cup. Just
There's a postscript about the doctor that came to her side when she was pregnant and lost the baby. And that is that Aurelia appointed that doctor the college physician for Mills College. So she didn't speak, somebody said she only spoke of the baby twice after it died.
You mentioned that the family boarding house was on LeConte, which is not a very long street. Do we know where?
Yeah, it was like right where PSR is. Yeah, right there. And it was like a slanted roof and very distinctive. And so like everybody called it, even after it wasn't the Henry boarding house anymore, they called it the Henry boarding house. So it was a landmark.
We're like right across the street.
Yeah, it was right across the street, literally across the street from where we are right this minute.
But the Starking was not there all the time.
No.
Starking, that building was built in 41, 42.
And apparently PSR was not there either.
Well, yeah,
Right.
yeah, clearly.